Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session today. My name is Lydia Paina, and I'm an assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in Baltimore. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to our session today. We're bringing together scholars and practitioners to reflect on institutionalizing social accountability in Brazil, Mozambique, and Uganda. And the discussion today reflects on the work of two consortia, the Unequal Voices Consortium and the Future Health Systems, and they're comprising organizations which play significant roles in both implementing and researching social accountability in their contexts. And we came together today because we are in a context which perhaps many of you know, where the evidence shows that short-term investments in social accountability have shown mixed results. So at the same point in time, scaling up and institutionalizing social accountability does not come with a fixed recipe. So we thought that the experiences that we're sharing today can give some insight into how changing systems norms to enhance community participation in health and system design can address the embedded power in politics in these contexts, but also the dimension of the time and history that is at the base of that. So our panelists will reflect on their experience, and I hope that the audience will contribute as well. We'll go through introductions, after which we'll have an opportunity to just have a discussion. Before we delve into the content, I wanted to make sure that you know how to engage with us as well. You will see that if you have any issues, there's a live support function. During the presentation, please use the live Q&A function so that we are able to get your questions, and we'll try to answer them as efficiently as possible. We also have a discussion forum that you should keep your eye on. We're hoping to fill it with some resources related to the work that our colleagues are talking about. And it's an opportunity to also go into more depth into the discussion. So hopefully you all can see those in your on your screens. So without further ado, I have the distinct pleasure to welcome to our panel Dr. Vera Chatan-Coelho, who is a social scientist and expert on policy analysis and public policy, and who's based in the Citizenship and Development Group at the Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning, CHIPRAP. So I'll hand it over to her to tell us more about the context in which she works and how she went about approaching the issue of institutionalization of social accountability in Brazil. So I apologize. I think that there is a glitch without, I don't know if you were all able to hear audio. So I'm sorry about that. Let me see if I can, let me try again. All right.
Thank you very much for organizing this panel. I will speak about the institutionalization of social accountability in the Brazilian public healthcare system, the SUS. That's a universal healthcare system. This process began in the 70s, so 40 years ago, a long time ago. And it's basically about making spaces of councils and conferences stable. These spaces bring together public official, civil society, and service providers to discuss health policy priorities and implementation. And today, we have this kind of conferences and councils at the national level, state level, municipal level, and in big cities, as São Paulo, also at the neighborhood level and at the units level. So we have a huge infrastructure for social accountability in Brazil. And this is stable. It's there for more than 30 years, and it works. And how was this made possible? First, we need to look at history. Now, we had the 1988 Constitution that made participation and health a citizen's right. We had social mobilization. There were really social movements that fought for making these rights real. And third, there was health professionals that believed in participation and universal health systems and tried to implement this while they were occupying important posts at the ministry, health secretariat at the state and municipal levels. So this made the social accountability mechanisms possible in Brazil. And what did these mechanisms make possible? Well, we looked at them since the 2000s, and we learned something. First, looking at the councils. They really, when they work, they bring civil society, providers, and public officials together, and citizens that use the public healthcare system talk a lot about what they see that work, that don't work, what their needs are, and they really can help to change the system. Second, it's very important to have social movements and organizations or associations that are at the local level participating in the councils. They really empower the council. They bring life to the councils. And third, public officials need to support the spaces. They need to help to facilitate the discussions, to organize the elections, and to take what is discussed and learned in these councils into the rest of the health system. And when we look at the bigger picture of the governance of the SUS, what did we learn about the institutionalization of social accountability mechanisms? We learned that sometimes these mechanisms come together with other mechanisms of accountability, as managerial accountability and political accountability. And then when this happens, it's easier to promote health initiatives that facilitate equity gains. This is very important, and we can speak more about this during the panel. Thank
you. Thank you so much, Vera. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Mariana Seron, who works at SUS, which is the Sistema Único de Saúde. She works as a manager of the Permanent Education and Sustainability Teams at the social organization SPDM, which is the Paulista Association for Development of Medicine. And she has a background in psychology and mental health and primary healthcare, as well as is in health and sustainability. Over to Mariana.
Hello, my name is Mariana Seron. I've been working for 15 years as a manager of 2 areas in social organization called SPDM, Paulista Association for the Development of Medicine. The area of permanent education for health professionals and the area of sustainability and social responsibility. Nowadays, SPDM has about 51,000 health and education professionals distributed in different types of services and in different social realities and levels of healthcare. SPDM has a strong partnership with the Brazilian public healthcare system to manage and provide services. SPDM works with public-private contracts run by the health public law. Its decision-making nature leads the high and medium managerial levels to instances that aim social accountability purposes. These contracts include service provision of primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of healthcare and education system. At all these levels, we meet opportunities and challenges that aim social accountability purposes, which I will explain ahead. First, a dimension to be considered is understanding of leaders, professionals, and population about what social accountability is, its purpose, and reach within the stakeholders of the health system. From an institutional point of view, one of the first associations that occur about social accountability is the mandatory transparency of the contracts, practices, and statistics results of the service. SPDM fulfills these regulations through its transparency portal at this website. Transparency is a part of our organizational culture. Externally, the control of execution of the contracts is held by the general accountant, district attorneys, internal and external audits, and the local health councils. In this perspective, the question that arises is the transparency of the financial, contracts, and statistics through open public channels sufficient to guarantee social accountability? In my view, expanded understanding is needed. This necessarily involves institutional education and communication improvement. To meet these goals, we work with both the health counselors and professionals. The local councils are composed by public, local, and the social organizations' representatives. Therefore, it's the social organization obligation to dialogue with all stakeholders in order to share the execution of its contracts. At this level, the social organization has a responsibility to strengthen the understanding of the meaning of social accountability. Today, this understanding varies according to the different realities in which our work is embedded. Despite the composition of the words, the guidelines are not always consistent with the real understanding of the concept. Therefore, in addition to transparency, there is still the challenge of transforming the formal phase of provision into tools for social participation, expanding the deliberative potential of the health councils. In my work, I am also concerned with the improvement of professionals' communication skills, as well as their perception of diversity of languages and needs Brazil have. At SPDA, both areas of permanent education and sustainability are fully focused on social accountability. We make intense efforts to engage professionals and the population served by the services in the knowledge about health policies, the nature of the SUS operation, the logic of accountability, the notions of health management, users' rights, and the very importance of health. Despite the obstacles, we work hard to implement our agenda of strengthening of the culture of social accountability. In this sense, we understand that permanent health education for professionals cannot be based only on bringing technical and scientific knowledge. The permanent education is carried out with a view of engaging them in the role of citizens committed with the collective construction of the SUS. In the sustainability sector, this activity extends to the most vulnerable communities, and the operation relies on the local network of community leaders in the construction of a local project for the neighborhood, aiming the impact of health and quality of life of the local population, covering basic sanitation, rational collection of solid waste, quality control of water from sources and streams, risks of infections and environmental intoxications, health promotion, and etc. To conclude, I would like to emphasize that although it's a term that's still little used in the daily life of services, social accountability is a part of the essence of SUS and its management model. I have the honor of participating in this construction through SPDA. There's a lot to do and opportunities to be taken to improve the SUS. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you, Mariana. So after learning a bit about how Vera and Mariana got involved in social accountability and their current work in Brazil, we'll hop over the ocean and head over to Alex. Dr. Alex Shanklin is a research fellow and convener. He's a social scientist who has worked for more than 2 decades on health systems, indigenous minority health systems, civil society, and political representation in local governments. He's worked particularly in Mozambique and Brazil. He was the PI of the Unequal Voices project, but also he served as a technical advisor for the social accountability work done by the Future Health Systems project. So I'll hand it over to him now to tell us a bit of more of his work and how he became involved in it.
So the work that I wanted to share in this session was conducted alongside several of the other speakers in this panel as part of a research project funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council, ESRC, and DFID, Department for International Development, called Unequal Voices, or Vozes Desiguais in Portuguese. And the Portuguese name is no accident. We were working in 2 Portuguese-speaking countries, Brazil and Mozambique. And we were looking at the political and social dynamics of accountability for health equity, forms of social accountability that are capable of reducing health inequities. I want to look at Brazil and Mozambique because not only do the 2 countries have close links, they share a common language and several parts of their history, but they have very similar frameworks for citizen participation in health. And these frameworks exist in very different historical, social, cultural contexts. So we were looking at to what extent do the institutional frameworks of social accountability operate in the same way in these different contexts. And in addition to comparing across the 2 countries, and we'll hear from some of the insights from that comparison from Vera and Cristiano in this panel, we also wanted to compare within countries. So in addition to being principal investigator of the research project as a whole, I was also part of a research team that worked on one of the Brazil case studies, which was in the Amazonian region of the Rio Negro in the northwest of the Amazon. And this case was used to compare with the São Paulo case, which Vera and Mariana will be speaking to. So This was looking in particular at the access of indigenous peoples to primary healthcare services. And the importance of that is that Brazil's health system has a specific subsystem for indigenous health. And it has, again, a very formally similar set of institutional arrangements for social accountability, consisting of health councils at the primary care unit level and at the health district level, which provide for representation of service users alongside managers and professionals in discussing challenges and ways to overcome them. So it's a similar architecture to what you have in Sao Paulo, but the indigenous health system has a few key differences, including the fact that it's centrally managed from Brasilia and that the providers are commissioned centrally by the Ministry of Health in Brasilia. So this represents a challenge for social accountability in that the local structures do not operate at the same level at which services are commissioned. So we looked at a particular case, which is where there'd been an outbreak of malaria, and indigenous leaders had tried to use the existing institutions of social accountability to activate a response to tackle the malaria outbreak, which was creating great alarm in the communities. So they went through the institutional channels and were unable to achieve the desired results. So they then mobilized vertically using their political social movement networks to access power in Brasilia. They reached the National Health Council and got action taken, which was then fed down the system. So this, on the face of it, was a successful vertically integrated social accountability strategy, claiming the right to health, the right to accountability in relation to a health issue. The problem is this took place in 2017, 2018, before the change in government in Brazil. And of course, it depended on having a space at the central level where social movement concerns could be heard. So when you have a change in political context, as has happened in Brazil, those strategies that rely on going up the chain to activate accountability through social movement action of this kind face a significant challenge. So that was one of our key findings in terms of what it takes to institutionalize social accountability. You do need the formal institutional structures, but you also need social movement energy and social movement mobilization to activate them very often, or they can remain ineffective. And finally, you need a politically enabling environment in order to overcome accountability failures at the local level by connecting with higher levels. So those were our key findings, and I look forward to discussing them further with you all in this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So we'll continue our tour, and we'll our next set of introductory remarks will be made by Dr. Cristiano Martinez. He's a social anthropologist based at the Center of African Studies at Eduardo Mondlane University, and he's also the director of Kula Research Institute. He spent a lot of time thinking about the meaning of accountability and decentralization in Mozambique. So we look forward to hearing a bit of the context in which you work in and how you became involved in thinking about institutionalizing social accountability.
Good day, everyone. From Mozambique, I would like to share some insights, challenges, and opportunities for institutionalization of social accountability, with particular example of the health sector. I've been working with multiple institutions across sectors, health, education, and social protection for the last 20 years in different capacity. But my deep diving on social accountability happened a few years ago when I joined the Voz de Desiguais program led by IDS. This was an opportunity to look further on health service access inequalities from user perspective, but also to the institutional accountability architecture within the health system. After initial mapping of the accountability landscape in Mozambique, we came to learn that narratives and practices about accountability were not grounded in a shared ecosystem or cosmology, in the sense that different players and stakeholders, such as the government institutions, civil society organizations, community-based entities, and multiple donors, have considerable different understanding of the meaning of social accountability. This becomes even more meaningful due to particular historic and the political context of Mozambique, where although the country has embraced a democratic and a multi-party political system since 1992, the political and administrative system remains highly centralized following a single chain of command. Since independence in 1975, the cultural contexts have been built in a way that citizens perceive public service provision not necessarily as a right, but as a part of a generous gift from the government and or political party, and this was not conceived to be challenged or questioned. If we keep in mind that institutionalization cannot be understood outside the cultural context, we will be in a better position to see how social accountability agenda unfolds in the Mozambican context. During the last 20 years, several entities, local, international, have been driving political, social, and administrative accountability agenda, and it seems that those efforts are now paying back. In our research, we took a closer look to the health sector from users' perspective, especially at rural and most underserved areas, and saw some changes in the nature and form of engagement of community health councils in the dialogue with local, district, and provincial health management system, vocalizing and channeling demands for service in a more participatory manner. Besides that, local NGOs are taking advantage of invited space for planning, management, and evaluation of health service provision at health facility level, using several tools such as community scorecards, now expanded to near 200 health facilities. While community constituents are becoming empowered to play a role in the institutional accountability channel through the bottom perspective, at the top, national NGOs with direct or indirect support from bilateral and multilateral donors are the ones who are making pressure for systemic and institutional use of accountability tools and mechanisms far beyond the usual financial and administrative audits. So far, the challenge remains on consolidation of the government role, in this case, the Minister of Health, to sustain an enabling platform to integration and institutionalization of accountability practice, and only then Mozambique will be in a position to display social accountability as part of service provision practices. In formal terms, after almost 10 years of reluctant acceptance, the Minister of Health has finally produced the drafts of the new health system policy, and is expected to broaden the role of multiple stakeholders in the health system. But again, from police perspective design to approval and implementation, it might take a few more years. In the meantime, institutionalization of social accountability remains as a myriad of good practices that are yet to be officially owned. Ownership is the key challenge for institutionalization of social accountability in Mozambique. I can share more as we go further in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cristiano. And last but not least, I have the pleasure to introduce Anthony Sebagereka, who's a research fellow in the Department of Health Policy and Planning and Management at Macquarie School of Public Health. Anthony has a background in pharmacy and a master's in health services research, but the way that we became connected is I had the very good pleasure to work with him and his team at Macquarie as they supported a rural district in Uganda to implement community scorecards. And Anthony was the one who led the costing portion of the study. So over to you, Anthony, to share a bit about how you became involved in this work and your perspectives on institutionalization.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Anthony Sebagereka is my name, and I'm a research associate in the Department of Health Policy, Planning and Management at Macquarie University School of Public Health in Uganda. As part of the Future Health Systems Research Program Consortium Uganda team that implemented a social accountability program to improve maternal and newborn care service delivery in Chiboko district. Now, Chiboko district is a rural district in eastern Uganda, and our pilot project was implemented in 5 sub-counties and 1 town council. We used the scorecard approach, which had mainly 5 phases. And these include the planning phase, the facility scoring, community scoring, district scoring, interface meetings, dissemination and feedback meetings, which are used to track progress with implementation of the work plans that have been developed. Now, we ensured that the implementation of the scorecard activities were mainly led by the district and sub-county leaders, mainly to promote ownership and sustainability of implementation of these activities. Given the highly dynamic nature of the district setting, we also had to, our approach had to be also highly dynamic in nature, able to accommodate these changes. For example, during the interface meetings, which were held at the sub-county level, during the first scoring round, we noticed that there was low participation of these activities of the community members. So we had to switch to the interface meetings being held at the lower level, which is the parish level, so that there is a reduced travel time for the community members, but also to increase participation. And these interface meetings also use as a platform to empower the citizenry to demand for their services, and also to hold the duty bearers accountable to their decisions and expectations. Our activities were guided by the Future Health Systems Project Institutionalization Framework, where we use the existing platforms and structures to implement activities, but also to hold the duty bearers accountable where they are not performing. We also used collaborative planning meetings with the key stakeholders at the district, the sub-counties, the health unit management committee members, the PhDs and the likes. The Makerere University Public Health team was providing technical assistance to the implementing teams, and we used the approach of eyes on, hands off. We're not involved in action implementation activities, but we're providing oversight role, technical assistance from time to time. Interface meetings and feedback meetings were also quite instrumental in tracking progress of the implementation of the work plans, but also increasing participation of the communities and holding the duty bearers accountable. We use the collective approach to solving the healthcare system challenges, where we noticed that not all problems in the healthcare system require money and funds to be solved, but actually many of them can be solved through fixing some issues of governance. It's also very important and critical to allocate a particular budget at the district level and even national level to be able to implement the accountability programs like the scorecard. Otherwise, without a particular budget to run particular critical aspects like transport, mobilization, you will not be able to realize any progress. Also, the critical core staff who are involved at implementation of the social accountability mechanisms and activities, these activities or roles should be enshrined within their job description. Thank you for listening, and bye.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Really appreciate that initial overview. So I'm going to stop sharing now. We've sort of concluded the first part of our session today, which was the introductions. And now in the second part, I would like to invite all of the speakers to join us in a more relaxed discussion. And before we do so, I guess I want to encourage you to keep your questions going in the live Q&A, and also to add any resources in the discussion forum that you'd like to add. So thanks again, everybody, for those insightful and rich discussions about how the context in which you work in. Now, maybe Vera, let me first go to you. You spoke about the key roles of having a policy in place, along with the social movement and the champions. Those are the sort of the three areas that you emphasized. And you mentioned the champions being both among providers and policymakers. And then you also spoke about the complementarities between the social, managerial, and political forms of accountability, which interacted over a very long period of time. So in your perspective, what are some of the trade-offs that happen, I guess, linked to institutionalizing social accountability in that context?
Okay, thanks, Lydia, for the question. I think there are two interrelated questions. I will first speak about the trade-offs about mobilization and institutionalizing participation, and then after we can speak a little bit more, or maybe Alex can speak about how they come together. There's an old discussion in Brazil concerning the trade-offs between social mobilization and institutionalization of social participation. And we analyzed this trade-off looking through the lens of two pairs of concepts: contestation, collaboration, and inclusion and exclusion. You can hear well?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I can. Yeah.
So I'll go back to history again to speak a little bit about what we learned about these trade-offs. In the 70s in Brazil, we saw a lot of popular mobilization and contestation to the military regime. One of the gains of this political process was, in the 80s, the creation of the first health councils, which were expected to help in translating popular demands and also pressing authorities to act. What was curious was that this process happened in a lot of areas, also in education, transportation, sanitation, and so forth. And so we had a first unexpected outcome of this process. That was the beginning of the, not the fragilization, but the fragmentation of the popular movements. That they began to specialize, to negotiate and to speak with authorities that were in different parts of the state. In the 90s, this process of institutionalization was accelerated by the 1988 Constitution, which laid the foundations for the creation of a huge infrastructure for social participation in Brazil. So for the optimists, this infrastructure would help to make public policies more transparent and more accountable to public needs, to the citizens' needs. For the less optimists, this will deepen the process of fragmentation of the popular movement. They will lose empowerment and also will be more cooptation into the system. Well, what we saw is that nevertheless, all this process, this strong process of institutionalization in 2013, there was a strong process of social mobilization. Citizens all over the country went to the streets to demand their rights, to protest. So something similar to what Alex described. You had a process of institutionalization, but also you had some capacity to mobilize. And so looking specifically at the poor neighborhoods we work with, we saw that institutionalization helped to strengthen the presence of the public healthcare system in these regions, and also that citizens kept their capacity to mobilize. So for us, it's less about the trade-off, and more about how you combine different forms of political participation. How associations, social movements, participatory and party institutions come together, and how they strengthen each other, or reinforce each other, or weaken each other. And this is very important. We don't have to make an option. No, we can work with both sides of the equation, as Gaventa always says. And so looking at this community, what we saw was that mobilization and participation were very important to guarantee the capacity of contestation to and cooperation with the state. So we saw these two movements, and also inclusion in the health policy process and in the public healthcare system, the SUS. So that's a first go. And later we can speak more about how they come together, the forms of accountability that we've been studying. Thanks, Ligia.
Thank you, Vera. That's very, very interesting. And I like the way that you put it between optimists and pessimists, that you can have two different perspectives. So even though you're not necessarily actively trading off, you will have stakeholders that can view the situation in different ways. And also, obviously, history gives a bit of a 2020 vision to that. And as part of that, I guess I'm also hearing how different sets of actors were, in a way, ascribing different meanings to the different forms of movements or participation, and how that varied over time, especially as maybe one intensified or policy came into place. So maybe next I was going to go to Cristiano and see if you have any thoughts. I mean, you're welcome to comment on the same question as Vera, but I know that you've also done a lot of work, as you mentioned, on understanding the meaning of social accountability and sort of understanding the cultural context. And the processes that you talked about, that Vera mentioned, really happened over a long period of time. Yet we know that we're eager in health to also get outcomes fast. So I guess I'm wondering about if you can tell me about the process and what strategies or evidence was helpful to you in the context of Mozambique to lengthen a bit the time horizon for social accountability, and to shift, to understand that meaning also evolves over time, and to shift sort of from a shorter view to a longer view.
Thank you, Ligia. I think that Vera brought to the discussion an important point, that the SUS, for example, in Brazil has almost 30 years of existence, and its work in that perspective. In the Mozambican experience, we are as a relatively new country with the independence in 1975. We have been through a transitional political system that led the way that the health system and the accountability system have been organized and structured. Starting from 75 up to the 90s, we lived in a context where everything was centralized and planned and organized in a very communist manner, with one single line of command. And you notice that I've highlighted that the notion of citizenship, the notion of participation, of engagement are very rare and almost conflictive elements of the political system in Mozambique. This starts to change in around the 1992 with the new constitution. But again, you know that this process takes time to build up from almost a zero system, and Mozambique is a highly dependent country. As a dependent country, the transition to this systemic democratic process also reflects on what's happening at the institutional level, and also it reflects on what's happening at the social level in general terms. So the right to association, the right of participation are very critical elements that are not necessarily developed strongly in Mozambique, except from the political and sometimes military side. But there is a merit in this process, because we saw from the 90s the growing of NGOs presence, civil society organization, donors, international, multi and bilateral partners, bringing about the agenda of social accountability, social participation, social movements. As we see this happen, we have some exceptional set of organizations, 12, no more than that, working with the government system, with the health system, trying to convert a system conceived as a control mechanism with community entities trained and prepared to report to the party, not necessarily to account for anything rather than passing the information to the next level. So it's an important and challenging mindset change in the context of Mozambique. If you allow me, I also want to jump to the challenges ahead, because we see that with this COVID experience, I would say that what's happening at a global level is also reflecting what's happening in local contexts like in Mozambique. And I would say that the accountability part of the global agenda have been experiencing some setbacks, especially for highly dependent countries like Mozambique. The transition of a bilateral stakeholders to more trade than aid-oriented partnership and the ruling of far-right political parties are also showing some concerning signs of abrupt changes in the way that governance and accountability related issues are being addressed. In addition to this global challenge posed by COVID-19, amid multilateral effort to push for a shared vision of a global health issues, we can add that the current global context, countries becoming a bit more self-centered and focused on trying to have their own political health and economic system somewhat responsive and accountable. The current prospect of returning to some sort of normalcy in the near future, probably in a couple of years perhaps, will demand additional change in the interface between citizens and governments and potentially funding entities. I'm bringing this point to discussion because the expected evolutive or regular progressive growing of what's happening in Mozambique might not follow the normal and traditional patterns of step after step in a very disruptive context, in a very changing environment. But the good side is what Vera put about the role of the cities, the concept of citizenship, the concept of participation as a key driver for institutional movement, institutional accountability. That's I would say by now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cristiano. Fascinating contrasting comparisons with some of the concepts that Vera mentioned in Brazil, and really interesting to hear about, I guess, the centralized nature and how that interfaces with the need to stimulate social accountability. I think you're also bringing up the idea that actually it's not just the accountability context that's changing, but also the larger landscape which influences it. Like you mentioned, the refocusing of certain donors on different issues which might have spillover effects down the line on how people view accountability at the service level. And you also mentioned, I guess, in the trade-offs between long and short views, the importance of keeping an eye to mindset. And I think that resonates with what Vera was saying as well, that it's really a mindset shift as the situation adapts on the ground. So thank you so much for that. Maybe next I should tag a question to Anthony. I mean, in the work that you did in Uganda and that we collaborated on, there was a lot of discussion about how to adapt, how to both take advantage of existing frameworks and hierarchies and structures for strengthening local accountability, but also how to adapt it over time so that it fits better within the context that it takes place. And I guess from a costing perspective, can you speak a bit more about that in terms of the, how did that reflect, adaptation over time, but also how does that fit into the whole changing of mindsets and also changing of hierarchies and structures? So I'll pass it over to Anthony, but maybe a quick reminder that the live Q&A is still live and open and available to anybody who'd like to chime in. But over to you, Anthony.
Yes, thank you, Lydia. And I will build on for your question, and I will build on the discussion that my colleagues Vera and Cristiano have really well placed out. That these are actually very critical aspects to consider when you really are planning to institutionalize social accountability approaches. So in Uganda, for example, there were critical aspects on to consider. For example, critical to that is ownership and involvement of the local leadership and local government leadership. So this was very critical And it took a bit of time to build their confidence, to know and appreciate that, well, this is not something that you're imposing on them or the communities, but it is something that actually will benefit them in the longer run and will actually also improve service delivery. And this is not only for the leaders, but also for their communities, that local communities that we're empowering. So it's very critical that we build ownership and also, you know, approach it in the sense that you're actually addressing local needs and local concerns. Because if we do not address the most critical aspects of that the communities are facing, or the local communities that are facing, then certainly we will be hitting a dead end. So it's very critical to consider that. We also found that if the more we routinize the social accountability mechanisms, then the better it gets towards, you know, being institutionalized, being part of the routine of the implementers, and hence even the communities will be used to it, and they will eventually adapt it in the long run. So it's quite critical, and also as a way of adaptation. We found that once the implementers, those are the district, local government, and the sub-county management and the leaders, once they are used to implementing this social accountability mechanism and approaches, they even feel part and parcel of it, and they're even more willing to allocate resources, like personnel, resources like budget, space, for such initiatives, because they feel it really serves their interests. So that was really quite critical in that. We also found that there was also some sense of social accountability already running within the system. For example, the Ministry of Health had rolled out the reproductive, maternal, and newborn adult child health scorecard at national level. But this was done in a scattered manner. It was implemented in a scattered manner. But particularly in Kibuku district, there was really hardly any of the scorecard activities happening. And also important to note that this scorecard that had been rolled out by the Ministry of Health was a facility-based accountability approach. So they were involving less of the community members into holding the duty bearers accountable. So we found that it's also quite critical that the community members who are actually the beneficiaries of the services that are provided should be part and parcel of this, and this will certainly be able to contribute towards ownership and adaptation of the long run of these activities. And certainly the supervision, we also noted that in the routine supervision that is done by the Ministry of Health and the district local governments, they should pay a more keen eye and more critical technical look at as to how they are actually implementing these activities, and how these activities eventually shift or change or improve the service delivery in the long run. I think I could leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. I appreciate those insights and sharing a bit about how in Uganda you and the team were trying to work within an existing structure that perhaps wasn't as activated, and trying to activate it, and the importance of as the structure is building, the importance of champions to be able to advocate, or even, as you said, dedicate their own resources to this effort. And recognizing that I guess the importance of this local leadership, but also of the push to try to make something routine. And I think that perhaps the environment that you're highlighting is one that's still moving towards I think Vera in her video describe the situation as stable. So having something that's routine and stable where that dialogue goes on. So that's very interesting. Thank you so much. Perhaps related to shifts and adaptation, maybe on the same theme. Maybe we can go back to Brazil, and Mariana, if you're on the line, I was wondering, from your perspective in Sao Paulo and as a practitioner, if you could maybe speak to the role of technology in adapting social accountability with an eye to institutionalization, and if you can reflect on perhaps even the role of technology in the context of the local pandemic, that would be interesting to hear.
Okay. Technology played a fundamental role to assure the quality of SUS services. It's been almost a year of the pandemic state, and that's brought a radical change in the ways we relate to each other. The need for social isolation was extremely challenging for us. Even before the pandemic, the absolute majority of educational activities, meetings, and social participation environments were in person, at health units or at community. The pandemic forced us to transform these physical rooms into virtual ones. This is still quite new, inducing important changes in our routine. On one hand, the virtualization increased the number of participants in our educational activities. On the other hand, more vulnerable professionals and users who previously was attending these forums were excluded from the digital process because access to technology in Brazil is still a social issue. Besides, the impacts of the internet on institutional communication channels and the construction of knowledge has been a challenge. News without official or scientific support began to circulate through social networks, causing greater difficulty in the understanding of pandemic and the role of health system. This quid pro quo equates fake news and official information. The official virtual communication and educational meetings were very relevant in this context for the dissemination of safe, evidence and scientifically based information, as well the guarantee of dialogue of professionals, the population, and health councils. It was also clear that there are limits to technology in the process of equity in the provision of health services. The most vulnerable and excluded segments of the population are still excluded from technology or have limitations on it. For them, face-to-face service, often at home during the humanitarian agents' visits, were essential. An example of this was the influenza vaccination campaign at the beginning of the pandemic, the health education process, even now the COVID-19 vaccination campaign. To conclude, it is necessary to emphasize that although the technological barrier is a difficult really to overcome, the pandemic caused decades of institutional advance in the culture to accept the virtual environment as an instrument of communication, management, social participation, and assistance, which contributes with social accountability purpose. This process developed and improved the access to information and services levels. An example is the attention and validation of telemedicine in the Brazilian Medical Council. In a country of continental dimensions, where the concentration of specialists is in the southern region, the possibility of carry out education and specialists performing virtual consultations is a very important legacy, and it generates more equity and access to knowledge, early diagnostics, and expedite attendance. With immeasurable gains and impacts in the public health, the technology also increases the use of the tools to management and in consequence to social participation, increasing the capacity of opinion formation to cell phones and personal computers. Our mission now is to empower this into something broader, communicative and efficient, with a vision of a more transparent SUS. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana. That's very interesting, and I think that it's also speaks, I guess, to the theme that we've had throughout the session of adaptation, but also of something being perceived from multiple perspectives. So you mentioned technology being actually a facilitator, like it changes norms around what is acceptable in terms of communication and participation. At the same point in time, it can be one that perhaps reinforces some of the inequities in access and might limit voice in that sense. But very interesting discussion about the spaces that are present and the role of technology from your practitioner perspective. So maybe before moving into the questions in the live Q&A, maybe let me hand it over last but not least to Alex. And Alex, you're welcome to comment on any of the issues that were raised before. I think you have sort of an eagle-eye view of being involved in all of the activities that are mentioned in all the different contexts. But I guess if you can also reflect on taking this long-term view of how do you know when something is institutionalized? What are the factors that are helping you sense that, I guess, also from a research perspective?
Thanks so much, Lydia, and thanks so much, everyone. Really, we've worked together a lot on future health systems and equal voices, and you kind of think you've learned all there is to learn, but then you hear colleagues speak about their work and you're always learning more stuff, which is fantastic. So yeah, so how do you know when it is institutionalized? And the answer is you don't really know until you test it, right? And I think we're in testing times. So the institutions of social accountability and the social relations that underlie them have been subjected to extreme stress in all kinds of ways, both from the deepening of exclusion that Mariana was talking about in terms of digital access to the changing behavior of donors that Cristiano highlighted and so on. So there are certain indicators that we can use to assess to what extent something's been institutionalized, but we always need to bear in mind that it's never a done deal. There's always, it's always a dynamic set of relations, and they change as contexts change. Having said that, I think we can look at the different components of it, and I think it was very well brought out by all the presentations, the extent to which different elements need to be in place and in combination, the right combination for successful institutionalization of social accountability. So Vera spoke about the multiple dimensions, about getting the politics right, as well as the social accountability relations, and then the management arrangements that underpin them. And Cristiano also referred to that in the context of Mozambique, and Anthony highlighted how important it is that ownership in the political sense is translated into resources in the practical sense, right? We know that institutionalizing social accountability has a cost, and I think the challenge for all of us as researchers, and that's why Anthony's work that he did with you, Ligia, and others is so valuable, is to help policymakers see that the costs are measurable, that the costs are not exorbitant, and that the costs are amply justified by the return in terms of strengthened relations of trust and improved performance, so that when they're stress tested by something like the pandemic, essentially if you've invested in building a strong set of social accountability relations, then the impact on trust and on relations between citizens and health services that a phenomenon like the COVID-19 pandemic brings can be adapted to and handled, and there can be greater resilience because of that investment. So I think being real about costs and resources, about political investment and financial investment, and the investment of personnel, as well as Anthony highlighted, is really important. So on one level, you can measure that. You can measure the resources that are put in, and Vera and colleagues in Brazil have shown just what an investment the Brazilian state made in training and resourcing this very impressive architecture of participation. And I think it's also encouraging that in Mozambique, in the work that Cristiano and colleagues have been doing, the argument is being won. So the very impressive scale up of community scorecards to which Cristiano referred was only possible because the World Bank essentially was pressured by Mozambican civil society to force the Mozambican Ministry of Health to accept an allocation of resources to support independent civil society-led community scorecard processes as part of the accountability framework for the Global Financing Facility program in that country, which is, I think, a very significant gain. And I think it's great that Cristiano has highlighted that progress. So there are hard dimensions, if you like, or visible dimensions around budgets, around personnel, and of course around formal rules. And Brazil has a very strong and in many ways, to use a phrase that's overused in the UK and usually inappropriately, a world-beating infrastructure of formal arrangements for participation and the institutionalization of social accountability in the health system. And indeed, with Vera and others, we've been involved in trying to bring that experience into the UK NHS in terms of learning about the institutionalization on the formal side. But of course, that needs to be backed up with tools and ways of working. It's not enough to have a law requiring you to set up a committee. You actually need tools like community scorecards, and you need those tools to be adaptable and flexible, adaptable for different cultural contexts, for different connectivity contexts, as Marianis highlighted. In our current work in the Amazon, the follow-up study we're doing to the one on which I commented in this session, we're actually looking at mixing a digital version of a community scorecard with oral indigenous language, two-way radio-based engagement as a way of keeping the social accountability processes going in the pandemic. So you've got to be flexible, you've got to be adaptive. So you need tools, and that requires the kind of technical support and engagement that Anthony described that the McHarry team had with the health authorities in Uganda. But of course, the soft side, the understanding of rights and citizenship that Vera very powerfully described for Brazil, the internalization of the right to answerability, the right to ask and be answered in accountability relations is fundamental. And I think it's in that sense, because not everywhere has Brazil's very peculiar history of political change accompanied by the institutionalization of formal rights. I think looking at citizens' own understandings and how they change over time, as Cristiano has done in Mozambique, is really valuable. And looking at how people draw on, so for instance, in Mozambique, as Cristiano says, people may have a sense that health services are more of a gift than a right because the powerful people may or may not give them to them. But there was also a memory that we found in Mozambique of the promises made by Frelimo, by the liberation movement when the country became independent. And there was a promise of health for all, and that's the promise of Alma Ata, and that's the promise that has been renewed in recent times at a global level. And I think people hear those promises and they don't always believe them, but they are there somehow to be drawn on and to be activated in creating the fundamental political compact that is necessary to institutionalize social accountability alongside the rules, alongside the resources, alongside the tools like community scorecards. That deeper understanding of rights and the right to be heard and the right to hold people to accountable is the fundamental ingredient, I think.
Thanks, Alex, for that very rich answer about, I guess, both the visible and invisible aspects of institutionalization. And I think that's those are so important because I think in research, especially, our tendencies to want to measure everything. But I think that appreciating some of the softer, informal understandings and how the culture influences that understanding over time is also important and not as easy to capture from just a short-term engagement. Maybe before we sort of come back to some summary conclusions, we do have a question from the live Q&A. Bev Johnson is wondering whether the speakers can address how social accountability activities have been tailored at the local level when the social accountability program is centralized at the national or at the regional level. I know that the centralization was mentioned in the context of Mozambique and also a bit in the context of Brazil. So maybe Cristiano and Vera, can I tag you to start us to answer those questions?
Cristiano, go ahead. Then I
Thank you,
follow.
Vera. Thank you, Lydia. I think that's a very important question, and it is in some way summarizes the challenge to have social accountability institutionalized. Because you cannot simply expect that you have the right tool, you have the financial resource, you have a broker. A broker, I mean that intermediate players like NGOs who can play the role of mobilizing, raising awareness, and trying to implement. There is a need also to have or to see the social accountability, political and managerial agenda growing from the bottom. And in this particular part, the notion I'm trying to bring about here that people are becoming more aware of their rights and more aware that if they exercise their right, if they engage with the governmental institution, they can have their interests, their needs addressed. Is becoming a very important part of the Mozambican ecosystem. And this is not going in one side, because now we are discussing in Mozambique decentralization process after all these years of central and single command system. And the political parties are engaging in this discussion. Electoral process are part of this process as a platform of building local and contextual knowledge based on needs locally identified, and trying to find platforms to address and raise those needs. And if by one side we have the political entity are becoming more important players in building culture of accountability, in the other side the need of the government as such to remain relevant in global dialogue about accountability and financial conditionalities, which is very critical in Mozambique, where the majority of the state budget is funded by international contribution. And there is another point in Mozambique that it is important to bring about. We have been up to now in a continuous civil war, and this is a concurrent process that is also a negative platform to discuss the reason why the Mozambique country is constantly in fight. And then part of this discussion raises issues about inequalities in terms of access to service, education, and health. And there's no peace agenda without trying to address all those issues. So we have a constellation of elements that, from my perspective, shows a great potential to contribute in this consolidation of the accountability agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cristiano. Vera, over to you if you have a brief final thought. You're muted.
Okay, now? Okay.
Yes.
So Cristiano just called attention to the important, not only Cristiano, Anthony also and Alex, the conditions that you need to social accountability to work, you know, at the ground level. I want to use this space to also call attention to something that was very important that appeared as a finding, you know, of our work. That was how different elements of accountability come together at the local level. So we looked at social accountability. We spoke a lot about this. Also at political accountability and managerial accountability. And in two cases that we compared in Sao Paulo and in Rio Negro, where the case that Alex spoke about, they came together in different ways. So in Sao Paulo, they were there at the local level, and they reinforced each other. So it's not, we had social accountability councils as a national program, but we had at the municipal level political competition and performance contracts, and social accountability in some way work together with these other elements. And in working together, and this is not trivial, you know, because we have the same things in Rio Negro, but they are not referred to the local level, to the municipal level. You know? You have managerial accountability at the federal level, councils at the district level, and you have elections at the municipal level also there, but they are not really referred to the areas where this health, indigenous health system work. You know? So when they come together and make up a virtual cycle, you know, each one making some difference for the other one, that is not only about having resources, it's having accountability mechanisms you know, that one can help to strengthen the other one. This helps to change the behavior of citizens, of politicians, of service providers, and of public officials, you know, because you change the incentives they have. This helps to shape differently their behavior, and it's easier to align there with the bigger picture of a universal healthcare system. You know? So this is what I would add here. You know, you need a number of co-conditions, and you also need a number of accountability mechanisms working together. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Vera. And we are at time. I think that it's been such an excellent discussion. Clearly, the beginning, hopefully, of a longer one, and hopefully one that we can take up again in person very soon. But before we, or as we conclude, I guess I just want to thank everybody for their insights about you know, the particularities of your context, but also the themes that are coming out in terms of both the visible and formal and informal approaches, as well as the multiple ingredients, as Vera mentioned, both in terms of accountabilities and the actors involved. So I wanted to flash some additional resources here for you, and then extend my sincere thanks to the panelists who have really contributed an excellent discussion, and also a particular thanks to the participants that joined us and were with us in this discussion. So thank you all. I hope that we can continue it and continue our collaboration in the future. So thank you. Have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks very much, Lydia, and all. It was really nice to hear.
Thanks, Ajay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.